They buried her just past noon, right under the big cottonwood that split the cemetery fence in two. It was the same spot where her shadow used to fall every Sunday morning on her way to chapel, a place she probably thought was safe. The preacher said her name, Alma Jane, but the words were hollow, empty, like he was reading a name off a grocery list, not laying a soul to rest. And nobody cried. Not a single person. Not even her own sister, who just stood there with her arms crossed tight, her face a mask of stone. You look at a picture of that day, and you'd think they were burying a stranger, not one of their own. But that's the thing about silence. It never lasts. And that's when the sound started. It was a cry, so soft at first you could have mistaken it for the wind. But then it grew, this tiny, heartbreaking wail that cut right through the dry air and the quiet guilt. Every head in that cemetery snapped in the same direction, toward the bundle, lying right at the foot of the fresh grave, wrapped in a faded blue shawl, a baby. Its little fists were trembling, its face red and pinched. Alma's baby. Born out of wedlock, the town whispered. Father unknown, skin just a little too dark for their comfort. And what did they do? What did these good, church-going people do? Nothing. Nobody moved. Nobody knelt down. Nobody even looked at it for more than a second. The preacher, he just cleared his throat, mumbled another line from his book, and took a step back like the baby was a coiled snake about to strike. They left a baby to die on her mother's grave. They thought no one was watching. They were wrong. Alma had been a ghost in this town long before she was a corpse. She worked down at the bakery, her hands always dusted with flour. She swept the chapel steps, her eyes always pointed at the ground. She never ever spoke about the man who gave her that child. The whispers, though, they did the talking for her. Some said he was a drifter, a man working the railroad who passed through and left nothing behind but trouble. Others, in hushed tones, said he was Comanche, a story meant to scare the children at night. But the old women, the ones who saw everything from behind their lace curtains, they had a different story. They said he was Apache, the quiet one. The man who brought Alma firewood all through the last, brutal winter and vanished before the sun was up. They never said his name. They probably didn't even know it. And now with Alma in the cold ground and her child lying in the dirt, the whole town just waited. They didn't know what they were waiting for, but they felt it, a charge in the air, a story that wasn't finished. Then they heard it, hoofbeats, cresting the far hill, slow, deliberate. Not the sound of someone in a hurry, but the sound of someone who was exactly where they were meant to be. A tall figure on a dark horse rode down the slope, silhouetted against the pale afternoon sun. He was wrapped in a soft brown hide coat, his hair in two long braids that touched his shoulders. His face was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the small crowd at the cemetery gate. He dismounted before he reached them and walked the rest of the way. And the crowd, that tight knot of judgment and fear, it just parted. Like the Red Sea, not out of respect, out of a deep, primal unease. He didn't say a word. He just walked right through them, his boots silent on the dusty path. His eyes went from the preacher to the fresh mound of earth, and then they locked onto the crying child. When he reached the baby, he knelt. The whole town held its breath. He rested a hand near the baby's tiny cheek, not quite touching, and he whispered something. A language that wasn't English, a language that sounded like river stones in ancient wind. And the baby stopped crying. Instantly, you could hear a gasp ripple through the women. The blacksmith, a big man with hands like hammers, actually took his hat off. But the Apache didn't move. He reached into a pouch on his belt and pulled out a small woven charm. It looked like it was made of cedar and white thread. He placed it gently over the baby's heart. Then, with a tenderness that seemed impossible, he lifted the child, shawl and all. He pressed the baby to his chest, tucked its head under his chin, and stood up. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't offer an explanation. He just took the child. And in that moment, not a single soul there felt like they had the right to stop him. Sheriff Weller, a man who'd faced down outlaws with guns drawn, took a half step forward, but then he just froze. It was like some older, deeper law had just taken hold, and his tin star didn't mean a thing. The Apache looked at Alma's grave one last time. He gave a single, sharp nod. Then he turned and walked back the way he came, the baby held securely in his arms. It was only when he mounted his horse, settling the child against his chest, that he finally spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but the wind seemed to carry it to every ear. Quiet English, shaped by grief and a strange, unbending honor. "Her name was Alma," he said. "I promised." And with that, he turned his horse and rode away. He rode west toward the canyons, leaving behind a silent church, a fresh grave, and a town choking on its own shame. Somewhere deep in the preacher's throat, a prayer died. The baby had stopped crying. But the town had only just begun to feel the weight of what they'd done. The silence he left behind was louder than the baby's cry had ever been. For days, the town didn't talk about it. Not in the open, anyway. But the whispers were everywhere. They curled like smoke between the pews at the chapel. They drifted over porch rails at dusk. They were stirred into coffee cups at the mercantile and passed behind half-closed shutters. No one said his name because no one knew it, so they just called him him. That Apache, the one from the Canyon Pass, Alma's ghost. Sheriff Weller took to sitting on the bench outside his jailhouse for longer than usual, just rubbing the worn gold of his wedding ring like it could give him an answer he didn't have. He'd seen 100 men carry guns. He'd seen men drag their enemies through the dirt. But he'd never seen a man carry a child like that. Not with that much purpose. It wasn't just possession. It was protection. "You think he'll bring it back?" the blacksmith muttered one morning. His hammer paused in mid-swing. "It?" his apprentice asked. And that one little word, that single syllable, echoed in the hot air with more force than the clang of steel on steel. It. The widow who ran the bakery started putting out one less loaf of bread each day, and Alma's name was never spoken behind that counter again. But at night, a new problem started. The children. They started asking questions their parents couldn't answer. Who was that man? Why did he take the baby? What did the baby do? And the parents would always say something that was half lie and half fear. It wasn't our place. He won't be back. But behind those weak words was a truth so sharp it could cut you. They hadn't wanted the baby either. They'd stood there at that grave pretending to be mourners. But they had left a newborn child in the dirt, as if grief was something that didn't stick to brown skin. Only one person in that whole town dared to speak a different truth. Hattie Mae, the preacher's blind daughter. She'd never seen Alma, but she'd heard her, humming lullabies to her unborn child from her porch 2 houses down. One evening, as the family sat in suffocating silence, Hattie's fingers tracing the hem of her shawl, she spoke up. Her voice was clear and steady. "He wasn't there to steal," she said to the room. "He was there to keep a promise none of y'all would have kept." No one answered her. They wouldn't dare. The truth from a blind girl's lips was too bright for them to look at. And still, no one went looking for the child. Not Sheriff Weller, not the preacher, not Alma's own sister. They didn't ride toward the canyon or past the river fork where the cottonwoods thinned out and the red cliffs looked like they were breathing. The baby was gone, but it felt unfinished. Every time the wind rustled through the leaves of that lone cottonwood by Alma's grave, more than a few folks would flinch, half expecting to hear hoofbeats returning. They were afraid of what he might bring back with him. Justice, maybe. But there was a new secret in town, one only the sheriff knew. Locked away in his desk drawer was the official birth record. It was unsigned, still a little damp in the corner, where Alma's last ragged breath had stained the paper. It read, "Female, unnamed." But that wasn't true anymore, was it? The Apache had whispered something to that child, something the wind itself had seemed to catch and hold. A name no one in that town had written down, a name no one there had heard. And somehow, that made it more real than anything else they'd ever recorded in their dusty old books. The town had chosen silence over guilt. They had chosen pride over mercy. But a child had been claimed. A man they'd never dared to know had ridden away with more grace and dignity than any of them could muster in a lifetime. And now every silence in that town sounded like a question. Would he raise her to hate them? Would she come back one day, a woman with his eyes and her mother's voice, and ask them what they had done? No one knew. No one wanted to know. But some nights when the wind shifted just right, blowing in from the west, a few of them swore they could hear something. Not a cry anymore. Not this time. It sounded like laughter. Small, soft, carried on the sound of hooves, fading into the canyon's deep breath. And they were right to be afraid, because the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. And the man they called a ghost was more real than any of them. But he wasn't who they thought he was, not even close. Deep in the canyon, miles from any town, the world grew quiet. The stars here weren't just lights in the sky. They hung low and heavy, like guardian eyes watching over the ancient, sleeping rocks. Here, the Apache, whose name was Kale, laid the child down beside a small, crackling fire. He hadn't spoken a single word since leaving the cemetery. He hadn't even spoken to the wind. But now, in the velvet hush of dusk, he knelt. Before them was a cradle board he'd made himself, woven from cedar bark and old sinew. It was a sacred thing, and he placed the child inside it as if he were swaddling a story that needed to be protected. Her eyes, wide and dark and full of a strange knowing, found his, and there was no fear in them. She hadn't cried, not once, since he'd whispered to her at the grave. He watched her for a long moment, the firelight dancing on his face, carving shadows into the lines of grief around his eyes. Then he spoke the name, the one he had chosen, the one he had promised to protect. Tyanita, he said, his voice soft, like a river stone that's been warmed by the sun. It meant little beaver, strong in the stream. It was the name Alma had told him, in secret. One night when her hands were still red and chapped from the bakery's dough, and her eyes were full of dreams she'd never dare speak aloud in that town of hers. She had chosen it for her daughter, but had never written it down, never said it where the wrong ears might hear it and twist it into something ugly. She'd only said it to him. One night, under a sky so quiet even the crickets stopped to listen. Now the name belonged to the child, as surely as the stars belonged to the sky. He placed the small cedar charm on her chest, the same one he and Alma had woven together that night, each thread a silent promise. The baby, Tyanita, curled her tiny hand around it, clutching it like she'd known it her whole life. Across the fire, his horse snorted softly and lay down, a sign it knew they would not be traveling again tonight. The canyon held them in its protective arms, old rock sheltering new life. In the quiet, Kale's mind drifted back. He remembered the first time he ever saw her. Alma. She'd been dragging a broken wagon wheel up a hill, her face streaked with dirt and sweat, and not a single person from the town had stopped to help her. He had watched her from the tree line, hidden. He only stepped out when her knees finally buckled, and her hands gave way. She hadn't flinched when she saw him, not like the others. She just looked up at him, her breathing heavy, and said, "You're not what they say you are." He hadn't answered. He rarely did. But he had stayed close after that, a silent guardian, never touching, never speaking for too long, just leaving fresh firewood by her door before dawn, setting snares for rabbits near her small cabin, watching from the ridge when a storm rolled in. She called him a ghost once, and then later, a friend. But there was always a distance between them. Not a distance of fear, but one of hard truth. He did not belong in her world, and she would never survive in his. But their friendship, their quiet understanding, was a secret garden in the middle of a desert. And it was there, in that secret space, that she told him everything. She told him about Elias, a teacher, a man who came to town with books full of poetry and eyes that saw the world differently. He was gentle and kind, and he saw the light in Alma that everyone else tried to snuff out. They had fallen in love, a fierce and secret love. But Elias had seen something he wasn't supposed to see. The town blacksmith, a man of brute force and quiet cruelty, cheating the railroad on a shipment of steel. Elias was going to report him, but the blacksmith found out. He framed Elias for a theft, planted evidence, and turned the whole town against him. Elias had to flee, to run for his life, with a warrant out for his arrest. The night before he left, he met Alma by the river. He promised he would come back for her. He made her promise to be strong. And he made one other person a promise. He found Kyle. He asked him, man to man, to watch over Alma, to protect her. She carries my child, Elias had whispered, his voice cracking. Keep them safe until I can return. I put their lives in your hands. Kel had given his word, a blood oath. He was not Tyanita's father. He was her sworn protector, bound by the honor of a promise made to a friend. And that promise was why he'd watched from the hills as her belly grew. It's why he'd felt a cold dread when the whispers in town turned vicious. It's why, when he learned Alma had died, a part of his own spirit had broken. He hadn't failed Elias. He had failed her. Now the baby slept, firelight dancing on her cheeks. Kyle didn't know if he could raise a child. He didn't know if his own people would even let him. But he knew one thing as certainly as he knew how to breathe. He would not leave her alone. Not in this world, not in any other. He would keep his promise. As the flames licked the night sky, he placed his palm gently on her small back. You are not shame, he whispered. He said it to her, and to the memory of Alma, and to himself. You are the beginning. And the canyon listened. But a new danger was already on the wind. Cal had kept his promise to a friend, but the man who had destroyed that friend was still out there. And he would not want a living, breathing reminder of his sins to survive. By morning, the canyon was alive with quiet judgment. The smoke from Cale's fire had risen into the high stone arches, and with it, word had traveled. Not by telegram, not by trail, but by the subtle language of the wild. A bird's call, a hoof print, a feeling on the wind. His people knew he was coming, and they knew he wasn't alone. When he rode toward the lower camps, Tyanita wrapped snug against his chest in the cradleboard, he felt the silence ripple out ahead of him. Children who had been chasing each other by the river bend stopped and stared. Elders, mending nets and carving wood, straightened their backs. A few of the women turned away from him completely. Not even the camp dogs barked. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. He dismounted slowly, keeping his eyes forward, his steps deliberate and grounded. He would show no weakness, no doubt. The head woman, an elder named Sally, approached him. She moved with the slow, immense weight of someone who had buried too many truths and survived too many winters. Her eyes, dark and sharp as obsidian, found the child first, and in them, a flicker of something painful, a memory, but not surprise. She stopped before him. She did not touch the baby. You bring a settler's child, she said, her voice low and hard, spoken in their native tongue. One born in shame. Cal did not flinch. He met her gaze. One born in silence, he replied, his own voice steady. Promised to her mother by a man who kept his word. He chose his words carefully. He did not say father. He said a man. Sally stepped closer, close enough to smell the cedar smoke still clinging to the baby's faded blue shawl. And you think silence will raise her? She asked, her voice laced with challenge. You think our ways will stretch to cover your sin? Around them, a ring of villagers had formed. Some looked angry, their arms crossed. Some looked afraid, their eyes darting from Cale to the child. All of them were waiting. Kyle looked down at Tyanita. Her little eyelids were fluttering in sleep, her hands still wrapped tightly around the cedar charm. No, he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that came from a place deeper than pride. I ask nothing from the tribe. Only a place where the wind is kind and the water runs clean. A man in the crowd scoffed. Another muttered, he brings a seed that is not of us. It will grow into a weed. But then Sally raised a single wrinkled hand, and all voices fell silent. Let him speak, she commanded, and then let the stones decide. At dusk they gathered in the canyon's heart. It was a sacred place, where three great monoliths of stone stood, each one marked by fire, wind, and the memory of burials. This was the place of old decisions, where the fate of the tribe had been weighed for generations. Cal walked to the center of the circle and placed the cradle board on the ground between the three stones. Tynita was awake now, her dark eyes taking in the firelight and the ring of silent faces without a single cry. She has no tongue to defend herself, Kyle said, his voice echoing slightly off the rock walls. He spoke to the entire circle, his gaze sweeping over every face. But I have eyes to watch her. I have arms to carry her. and I have a heart that already knows her name." He then told them the story. Not the whole truth. The secret of Elias was his alone to keep, but a version of it. He spoke of Alma's kindness, of the town's cruelty, and of the promise he had made to see her child safe. He spoke not of sin, but of honor. As he spoke, something began to shift. A few of the older women, the ones who remembered the world before it was carved up by fences and borders, began to nod slowly. They knew what it was to be an outcast. They knew the bitterness of a promise broken. Then a young woman stepped forward from the circle. She walked to the cradle board and placed a small, leather-wrapped bundle of milk root beside it. Then she looked at Sally and nodded. Another woman followed, leaving a folded, soft-spun cloth. No one cheered. No one smiled. This was not a celebration. It was a quiet, solemn acceptance. When Sally, the head woman, finally spoke again, the hard edge in her voice had softened. It had shifted from judgment to resignation. "The stones say nothing," Sally announced, "but the child is warm, and no child should be cold." It was not a welcome, but it was not a rejection either. That night, Kel was given a lodge on the far edge of the camp, set apart, not as a punishment, but as a space for the tribe to watch, to see. Tianita slept soundly between soft furs while Kale sat by the fire, carving her a rattle from a river-worn branch. He did not celebrate. He did not weep. But as he worked, for the first time in years, he began to sing. A low, quiet song of protection, a song his own father had sung to him. It was just loud enough for the child to hear. And in her half-sleep, she smiled. In the morning, he would begin to teach her how to walk with soft feet on hard ground. But for now, the canyon had not rejected her. The tribe had not turned her away. He had not failed. Beneath the stone sky, two breaths rose together into the cold night air. One old, one new. And neither was alone. But back in the town, a different kind of judgment was about to be unearthed. A truth, written in ink, was waiting under a loose floorboard. And it was about to change everything. Far away from the canyon, past the dusty ridges where vultures circled and stagecoaches left trails of fading memory, a hand reached for an old leather ledger. It was buried beneath the floorboards of the Widow Barnes's apothecary. She hadn't meant to find it. She was just sweeping out the moths from a dark back corner when her broom struck a loose plank. Curiosity, a powerful thing in a woman who'd seen as much as she had, made her pry it up. And there it was, a leather-bound book. When she saw the initials burned into the cover, her breath caught in her throat. A.J. Alma Jane. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. The yellowed pages were filled with Alma's neat, careful handwriting. Notes on herbal tinctures, recipes for poultices, instructions for midwifery that Widow Barnes herself had taught her. Alma had been her apprentice, her quiet shadow. But at the very back of the book, there was a single entry. The script was smaller, shakier, written with a hand that was clearly running out of time. Due in spring. Name, Tianita. Father unknown to town, known to me. His soul is quiet as snow. Widow Barnes sank back against the wall, her heart a tight, painful knot in her chest. It all came flooding back. Alma's shy smile. The way she always lingered too long over the cedar oil, breathing in the scent. The time she'd quietly asked what kind of salve could make a scar feel less like a memory. The ledger didn't lie. The girl had loved, not loosely, not foolishly, but with a deep and silent passion, the way so many women had to. Too afraid to speak the name of a man the world would never, ever accept. And then, the final crushing memory. Widow Barnes closed her eyes. She had been the one. She had delivered Alma's baby in the dead of night, in a cold back room, the only soul willing to help her. She had been the one to wrap the tiny girl in that blue shawl, while Alma bled out into the straw, her life fading with every ragged breath. And with her last words, Alma had whispered, "Tell no one, but if he comes, give him this." She had pressed a small woven charm into the widow's hand, the cedar charm. The old woman had waited. She had gone to the funeral, the charm hidden in her pocket, and she had waited. But no one came, not until it was too late. Word had reached her later that day, a whirlwind of gossip, that an Apache had taken the baby right from the graveside. Now holding the ledger, it all clicked into place. Alma's faith had not been misplaced. He had come, and he had known the child's name. It was a story far more profound than the town's ugly whispers. With a grim breath, the widow packed the ledger into her satchel. She knew what she had to do. She saddled her old stubborn mule. She wasn't going to the preacher. She wasn't going to the sister. She was going to Sheriff Weller, not to ask questions, but to give him the answers he was too afraid to look for. Meanwhile, back in the canyon, Tianita held her new rattle in both hands, shaking it with a fierce seriousness that made her guardian's lips curve into a rare smile. He didn't need to teach her joy. It came to her uninvited, like rain on dry earth. But he taught her other things, how to press her palm to the ground and feel the distant vibration of hoofbeats, how to touch the surface of the river and know its current, how to listen, truly listen, when no one was speaking. The rest of the tribe watched them from a distance. The gifts started to appear, not given directly, but left for them to find. A marrow bone for soup, a small carved doll, a string of blue beads left on a stone at the edge of their lodge. Cal never asked who left them. He just gave a single nod toward the sky, as if thanking a spirit that still believed in promises. One evening, as smoke curled from their fire, Sally, the head woman, came to their lodge again. "There is word," she said, her voice neutral. "A white woman from the town. She carries a book with the child's name written in it." Kyle stiffened. A book? From the town? It could only mean one thing. Trouble. "Is she coming here?" Sally shook her head. "Not yet. She rides to the sheriff. The word from our watchers is that she carries no anger, only memory." Then the old woman did something that shocked him. She crouched down before Tianita, who was sitting in the dirt, and let the little girl reach out and touch her long, gray braids. "She will walk two paths," Sally said, more to herself than to Kyle. "Let her feet learn both without shame." That night, as the moon hung low and turned the canyon rocks to silver, Kyle looked down at the sleeping child and wondered what Alma would say. Seeing her daughter alive, warm, held in the heart of a people who, by all rights, should have turned her away. He didn't know what lay ahead. But in that moment, he whispered her name again, Tianita, and she answered with a quiet coo in her sleep. The wind stirred like a page turning in a book, and far away a mule carried a leather-bound ledger toward a collision with the law. The truth was coming, and it was going to hit that town like a flash flood. Sheriff Weller had seen his share of odd arrivals in his dusty office. Busted wagons, runaway brides, snake oil salesmen with silver tongues and empty bottles. But nothing, and he meant nothing, rattled him quite like the sight of Widow Barnes walking in, her face set like stone, a dusty satchel in her hand. Her eyes were fixed and dry, like she'd outlived her right to cry about anything. She said nothing at first. She just walked to his desk, laid the old leather-bound ledger on it, and gave him a single sharp nod. The air in the room grew thick and heavy. He opened it without protest. He knew this was something he couldn't ignore. He thumbed past the neat entries about herbs and remedies until he reached the final page. He read Alma's shaky script. That one quiet, powerful sentence about the father, the name Tianita, and the truth she never dared to say aloud. Something inside his chest twisted, a cold knot of shame. He leaned back hard in his chair, the wood creaking in protest. He let the silence stretch out, hoping it would swallow him whole. "Why now?" he finally asked, his voice raspy. Widow Barnes sat down across from him, her posture as straight and unbending as an iron rod. She smoothed her skirt with the slow dignity of someone who had already counted the cost of what she was about to do. "Because that baby wasn't abandoned," she said, her voice clear and strong. "She was entrusted, and that Apache sheriff, he didn't steal her. He fulfilled a promise that none of us were brave enough to even acknowledge." Weller stared at the name again. Tianita. The weight of his own failure, his own silent complicity, pressed down on him. His tin star felt like it was made of lead. "They'll ask what I did," he murmured, mostly to himself. "What I allowed to happen." Widow Barnes nodded. "They will. So you tell them. You tell them you saw a man do what no one else would. You tell them you saw honor." He closed the ledger slowly, the leather cover soft under his hand. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, feeling a headache coming on. Where is she now? The child? Some say the canyon, the widow replied, her gaze distant. But wherever she is, she's safer than she ever was in this town. Weller stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the dusty main street. He watched children chasing chickens, mothers hanging laundry on a line like rows of white flags surrendering to the day. He'd watched Alma pass this very window every Sunday, her hair tucked neatly into a bonnet, her back straight despite the whispers that followed her like a shadow. He'd never wondered why she never looked up. Now he knew. If she'd looked up, she would have seen all the faces that didn't care, all the eyes that judged her, all the people who were now asking where her baby had gone. Behind him, Widow Barnes rose to leave. "You still the law in this town, Sheriff?" she asked, her hand on the doorknob. "I try to be," he said, his back still to her. "Then you best start acting like it." The door closed behind her, leaving him alone with the silence and the ghost of Alma's handwriting still etched behind his eyes. He didn't move for a long time. He just stared at the empty spot on his desk where the ledger had been, a space that now felt like a gaping wound. That night, long after the town was asleep, Sheriff Weller lit a lamp in his office. He unlocked his bottom drawer and pulled out the town's official record book. He turned to the birth ledger, to the entry that had haunted him for days. He uncapped his inkwell, dipped his pen, and did what no one else had done. He gave the child a name. He wrote, Tyanita, female. Mother, Alma Jane. He paused, then continued writing, the scratching of the pen the only sound in the night. Father unknown, claimed by guardian at Alma's request. He stopped again, thinking of the man at the grave, the quiet dignity, the impossible tenderness. He added one last line, seen last in the arms of a man who did not speak, but who did not have to. He closed the book. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't justice. Not yet. But it was a start. It was a truth, finally written in stone. Meanwhile, in the canyon, the stars watched over Tyanita as she laughed in her sleep. The rattle Kale had made for her, slipping from her small hands. Her guardian gently placed a hide blanket over her and stepped outside the lodge. He looked up at the stars, wondering if Alma could see her now. He was so lost in thought, he didn't hear Sally approach until she was right behind him. "The world of the settlers remembers through paper," she said softly, her voice carrying on the cool night air. "But we remember through wind." He nodded, not needing to speak. "Still," she continued, stepping beside him to look at the sky, "sometimes it helps for the paper to tell the wind's truth." Far off, a nightbird cried out, its call echoing through the canyon. Sally reached down and placed a single carved eagle feather at the base of the lodge's entrance. "When the white woman comes," she added, her meaning clear, "let her see not what we took, but what we kept alive." He watched her walk back to her own lodge, her form swallowed by the darkness. He turned back, his heart feeling a strange mix of fear and hope. He entered his lodge where the child was now murmuring in her sleep. A single word he had not taught her. "Mama," she whispered, and the entire canyon seemed to still, to listen. He sat beside her through the rest of the night, not to protect, but to witness, not to teach, but to remember. For in that one moment, caught somewhere between a dusty ledger and a quiet lullaby, the child had found her voice, and soon the whole world would hear it. The path to the canyon wasn't marked on any map. It was a route you found with instinct, or you didn't find at all. But Widow Barnes found it. She rode her mule slow and steady, with the ledger strapped tight beneath her cloak. Across her saddle horn, she'd placed a loaf of almond bread, wrapped carefully in a white cloth. She hadn't asked permission to go. She certainly hadn't told anyone. She just rose before the sun, left a note for the boy who delivered her milk, and left behind the town that had buried a girl and tried to forget her child. The journey was long. The land was unforgiving. But the sky above was a clear, boundless blue, and the wind felt gentle, as if the elements themselves had decided to ease her passage. When she finally reached the high stone shelf that overlooked the inner canyon, she saw them, and the sight made her pull back on the reins, her breath catching in her throat. Down below, by a small, smoking fire, the Apache warrior, Kyle, was kneeling. The child, Tyanita, was balanced in his lap. She had a makeshift crown of wildflowers and bright feathers tangled in her dark hair, and her giggles, pure and unrestrained, echoed off the ancient canyon walls. For a long moment, Widow Barnes just watched, and in that watching, something inside her that had been brittle and hard for decades cracked open. Not in grief, but in simple, profound awe. This wasn't a kidnapping. This was a sanctuary. When she finally dismounted, her old knees ached, but her heart felt younger than it had in years. She walked down the narrow path into the camp, not raising her voice, not making any sudden moves. Kyle looked up as she approached. His dark eyes were calm. There was no alarm in them, only a quiet watchfulness. She paused a few steps away from the fire. Slowly, deliberately, she untied the ledger from her satchel and held it out to him. "She wrote about you in here," the widow said, her voice a little shaky. "Or maybe it was for herself, but it's yours now." He stood without a word, the child still in one arm. He took the ledger gently from her, his fingers brushing hers. He held it to his chest for a moment, a gesture of deep reverence before handing it to Tyanita, who reached for the strange object with curious fingers. "Her name is Tyanita," he said. They were the first words he had spoken aloud to anyone from the outside world since Alma's death. "I know," the widow replied, a small smile touching her lips. "I read it in her mother's hand." They sat by that fire as the day stretched long and golden. Widow Barnes told him everything. How Alma had hidden her love like a sacred ember. How the town had looked away, their silence a weapon. How the child had entered the world without a single soul to welcome her. He listened in that profound silence of his, only nodding when she spoke of Alma's quiet songs, her gentle defiance, the strength that made her so dangerous to people who live by rules instead of love. In return, he told her his story, how he had watched over Alma from afar, a silent guardian against sickness, against wolves, against loneliness. He told her how, one time, Alma had left a single strand of her hair tied to a pine branch on the trail, a secret signal so he'd know she was still walking the earth, that she was safe. He told her the baby's laugh reminded him of a creek in the springtime, and that some nights he could feel Alma's breath in the canyon wind. Widow Barnes wiped a tear from her eye with the rough edge of her shawl. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the bread. "She always loved almonds," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "baked with them every Thursday." They broke the loaf in silence, a strange communion between three people from three different worlds. They fed small crumbs to the child, who squealed with joy at the unexpected sweetness. As the sun dipped low, painting the canyon in hues of gold and fire, the widow stood up. Her time here was over. "I'll tell them," she said, her voice firm now. "The town, the preacher, the ones who doubted. I'll tell them the truth." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something other than grief or watchfulness in his eyes. It was relief. "Tell them what you need to," he said. "No," she corrected him gently. "I will tell her story. I will tell it true, word for word." As she rode away back up the winding path, the child Tyanita reached out a small hand and gave a little wave. The old widow waved back, smiling through her tears. Behind her the fire glowed soft and warm. The warrior began to hum an old quiet lullaby, and the wind picked up the sound, carrying both memory and promise out of the canyon and into the darkening sky. The truth was coming home. By the time Widow Barnes returned, the sun was a dying ember on the horizon, casting long, amber shadows across the chapel steps. The very steps where Alma used to pause every Sunday, gathering her courage before slipping inside, unnoticed and unwelcome. The widow dismounted, her old joints groaning in protest, but her spirit felt sharp and honed, like a newly forged blade. She didn't stop at her apothecary. She didn't go home to rest. She walked straight to the church. In her hands she gripped two things, a single sheet of paper, folded neatly, and a sprig of dried cedar tied with a faded ribbon that had once been Alma's. The preacher, a weary man whose faith seemed to have been worn down by too many sermons and not enough conviction, stepped out to greet her. His eyebrows were raised in mild surprise. "Evening, ma'am," he offered. "You need something?" She didn't say a word. She just held out the folded piece of paper. He hesitated, then took it. He began to read. It was a page she had carefully copied from Alma's ledger. The part about Tyanita's name, the part about a love quiet as snow. And below it, the widow had added her own testimony, a clear, unflinching account of the promise made and the promise kept. Not by the town, but by a man they feared to know. As the preacher's lips moved silently over the words, his face changed. The passive weariness was replaced by a flush of shame. He looked up, his eyes wide. This is true? He stammered. Every last word, she said, her voice like flint. And it's long past time someone heard it out loud. He blinked, uncertain, looking around as if the town's silent judgment was a physical force. Folks they might not take kindly to this. Then they'll have to reckon with their own silence, won't they? She interrupted, her patience gone. She turned from him, walked up the steps to the heavy oak door of the chapel, and with a rusted nail that was already protruding from the old door frame, she pinned the letter there, high and bold, right where the morning light would hit it. By dawn, every person on their way to the mercantile, to the blacksmith, to their own miserable lives would have to read it. Tanita was not abandoned. She was loved. She was claimed. She was named. She was not ashamed to be hidden. She is a life honored by hands stronger than words. Below the letter, she tucked the sprig of cedar into the frame, a silent testament. And just as she knew it would, the town began to whisper again. But this time the whispers had a different shape. They were sharp with guilt. The dressmaker clutched her apron as she read it, a sudden, painful memory surfacing of Alma shyly asking the price of a bit of lace, then walking away when she couldn't afford it. The banker's wife, a woman of high standing, turned her face away, ashamed of how she'd steered her own children's eyes from the funeral procession. Even Sheriff Weller stood before the letter for a long, long time, before finally walking away without a word, his fists clenched tight at his sides. That afternoon, someone lit a single small candle and placed it on the church steps. An hour later, there was another. By dusk, a dozen tiny flames were flickering against the wood, a small constellation of remorse, as if trying to warm a memory the town had tried so desperately to let freeze. Far away in the canyon, Cal felt the shift in the world without ever being told. He sat by the fire, Tyanita in his lap, gently brushing her dark hair as she hummed a little song to herself. When she looked up at the stars and said, "Mama," again, he followed her gaze and whispered back, "She hears you." That night, the tribe gathered, not to judge, but to listen. Sally stood before them, holding the leather ledger that Widow Barnes had left, now carefully wrapped in soft hide and kept in a place of honor by Cale's fire. "This child walks two paths," the head woman announced, her voice ringing with a new strength, "and we will not dim either one." The others nodded. This time, there was no hesitation. A few stepped forward and touched the cradle board where Tyanita now slept, offering quiet blessings, leaving gifts of beads and feathers. They were no longer strangers looking at an outsider. They were kin. Back in town, under the cover of darkness, someone placed a single warm almond loaf on the chapel steps, right beneath the letter. There was no note, no name, just warmth, returned at last. And in the canyon, the child dreamed of cedar trees, of warm hands, of a song being sung in two languages at once. The wind moved softly through both worlds that night, brushing past gravestones and lodges alike. And for the first time since Alma's burial, the town and the canyon seemed to exhale together. A breath of sorrow, a breath of hope. The bridge was being built. Spring came early that year. The snowmelt rushed down the canyon streams in a torrent, and wildflowers bloomed in cracks of rock where nothing had dared to grow before. Tianita had begun to walk. Her first steps were unsteady, her arms flailing like a baby bird trying to find its wings. But with each passing day, her steps grew more certain, more fearless. Her guardian Kyle watched her with a quiet, profound pride. He never guided her unless she looked back for him, which she often did, her dark eyes searching for his, as if to make sure he was still there, still real. He carved her a small flute from a piece of juniper wood. Her fingers fumbled with the holes, and the notes that came out were airy and off-key, but her laughter as she played made it sing louder than any proper melody. Around the camp, the villagers had given her a name in their own tongue. Sani Jola, little sunrise, for the way her arrival had changed the feeling of the morning. But Kale never claimed victory. He knew that peace was not a thing you were given once. It was a thing you earned every single day, in silence and in care. Then came the morning Tayanita did not wait for him. She slipped from the lodge just after dawn, the cedar charm tied proudly around her neck, and the eagle feather from Sali clutched in her hand like a flag. By the time Kale noticed she was gone, a cold knot of panic tightening in his chest, she had a head start. He saw her trail immediately, a series of tiny feathers she'd been collecting, dropped one by one, like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. The panic wasn't because he feared harm from within the tribe. It was because the world beyond the canyon still did not understand her, did not know her story. He followed the trail up a steep deer path, his steps swift and silent, through the scrub brush and over the rocks, until he reached the canyon's edge. And there she stood, no older than 2 springs, barefoot in the dirt, holding her eagle feather out to a man who was frozen in place beside his saddlebags. It was Sheriff Weller. He hadn't meant to find her. He had been following an old trapper's trail, hoping to leave a small sack of flour and seeds on the ledge. His own quiet, clumsy way of saying, I remember her now. I'm trying to do right by her. But seeing the child, standing there alone and completely unafraid, offering him a feather like a sacred treaty, it undid him. He dropped to one knee, his eyes wide with a feeling he couldn't name. You're real, he whispered, the words stolen by the wind. Just then, Kale stepped into view from behind a cluster of boulders, slow and steady. His eyes were calm, but they were unblinking. A silent, absolute warning. Weller's hands shot up, palms open. I didn't touch her, he said, his voice strained. I swear. She found me. Kale's gaze shifted from the sheriff down to the child, then back again. You carry no weapon, he observed. It wasn't a question. Weller shook his head. Not today. There was a long silence, the kind that only happens between 2 men who have both wronged and been wronged, who stand on opposite sides of a divide but are bound by the same story. Then Tainita toddled over to the sheriff. She placed her precious eagle feather into his open palm, looked him right in the eye, and said a single word. Safe. One word, clear, chosen, and somehow heavier than any law Weller had ever sworn to uphold. Kyle stepped forward and gently lifted the child into his arms. He looked at Weller and gave a slow, deliberate nod. She remembers what others forget, he said. Weller swallowed hard, his throat thick. I came to leave a gift. For her, that's all. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a small parcel wrapped in red cloth. It's seeds. Alma ordered them once from back east. She said the town's bread was too bitter. Kyle took the parcel. He nodded once more, a gesture of acceptance, of understanding. He turned to go. But before he disappeared back into the canyon shadows, he paused and looked back over his shoulder. Her name is Tayanita, he said. Not as a warning, but as an offering. A bridge of a name, spoken between 2 worlds. Weller stood there long after they were gone, just staring at the path the child had made, one feather at a time. That night, back in town, he walked into the empty chapel. He placed the single eagle feather on the ledge beside the now weathered letter that still hung on the door. And deep in the canyon, Kyle placed the red parcel near the fire and let Tayanita open it. She squealed with delight, scooping up handfuls of tiny almond seeds and tossing them like stars into the dust. Far above them both, the moon rose wide and round, as if it were watching a bridge quietly, miraculously, build itself between 2 lives, 2 stories, 2 names. Each step, each feather, each seed, it was a piece of something the world had nearly lost, but now might just remember forever. The first time Tayanita wrapped the faded blue shawl around her own shoulders, it was nearly too small. The worn fabric only covered her chest now, the ends barely reaching her elbows, but she wore it with the solemn care of a ceremony. She traced the old uneven stitches where her mother's hands had once mended a tear. She held the soft edge to her cheek, as if it could still carry Alma's scent on the wind. Cal watched her from the doorway of their lodge. His arms were crossed, the firelight casting orange halos across his stoic face. She was older now, not yet a woman, but no longer a child. Her eyes were sharp with an understanding that went beyond her years, and her steps on the canyon floor were firm with a quiet grace. That morning she had asked him the question he had been waiting for, and dreading for years. "When do I go?" He hadn't answered her right away, because the truth was, she had already begun to leave. The village had long ago accepted her as one of their own, but it was clear to everyone that she would not stay in the canyon forever. Sally was right. She had to walk two paths. Tianita had questions, not questions of blood or betrayal anymore, but questions of voice, her mother's voice, and the silence of the worlds that had tried to keep them apart. She wanted to speak the words Alma had never been allowed to say. She wanted to teach others what the canyon had taught her, that strength and silence were not opposites. And so he had given her the shawl. Not as a goodbye, but as a grounding, a reminder. "You are not just where you came from," he told her, his voice low and steady. "You are also where you decide to walk." She nodded, silent, and packed her small satchel. Inside she placed the old leather ledger, the cedar charm, and the eagle feather that Sheriff Weller had quietly returned to the canyon ledge on his last silent visit. When she left, she didn't ride a horse. She walked. She walked the familiar canyon paths that had once whispered judgment, but were now blooming with the almond trees planted from the sheriff's seeds. She walked past the riverbanks where the tribal elders dipped their baskets and raised their fingers in a silent blessing as she passed. She walked out of the canyon and into the town that had once left her to die in the dirt beside a grave. And this time, they did not look away. The preacher, his hair now white as snow, opened the chapel doors for her. Children, the sons and daughters of those who had stood in judgment, peeked from behind porch posts, their eyes wide with wonder. A woman ran out from the bakery, her hands trembling, and pressed a warm almond loaf into Tianita's hands. She did not stop to weep or to rage. She walked straight to the chapel steps, pulled the weathered ledger from her satchel, and opened it. Her voice when she spoke was not loud, but it was clear, and it carried in the still air. She read aloud the entry her mother had written, the one that named her, the one that claimed her, the one that no one had honored when it mattered most. When she finished, she looked up, her gaze sweeping over the silent faces of the townspeople. "This is the truth," she said, "and I am its daughter." No one clapped, but no one interrupted. Not the woman who had once called Alma wicked, not the man who had spat near her cradle, because when they looked at her now, they didn't just see the child of the Apache they feared, or the ghost of the girl they had scorned. They saw the bridge, and it looked like a young woman in a faded blue shawl, standing right where their history had once been broken, and making it whole again. That evening, Tianita walked back toward the canyon. At the crest of the trail, the last place you could see the town, she turned. Sheriff Weller, now an old man, was standing at the edge of town, his hat in his hand, his head bowed. She gave him a single small nod. He raised the eagle feather she had once given him so long ago. A gesture returned, a circle completed, and then she disappeared beneath the ridge, back into the arms of the wind and the memory of the canyon. At the fire, Kel was waiting. She didn't speak when she arrived. She simply unwrapped the almond loaf, broke it in half, and handed him a piece. He accepted it, just as he had accepted her all those years ago, without condition, without question. As the night fell and the stars returned to their endless watch, the two of them sat in a comfortable silence, not to mourn a past that was lost, but to mark a future that had been earned. The girl no one would touch had grown into the woman no one could silence, and the shawl she carried forward no longer wrapped a wound, it wrapped a legacy. If you enjoyed this story and want to support more soul-deep tales from the echoes of the past, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support is what keeps these stories alive. And before you go, I have a question for you. Think about it honestly. Leave your answer in the comments below. If you had been there that day and had seen that baby lying beside her mother's fresh grave, would you have stepped forward?